Yes. Sorry, Richard.
No, nothing to be sorry about.
Thank you. Yes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back live with an extended Louis B. Free radio show, Brain Food from the Heartland today. Well, extended because I have such a amazing guest that it's going to blow your mind. I think that's the only way I can say it, Richard. And I already alerted Richard that I'm very disorganized and maybe all over the place. So I certainly will be. Alerted Richard that I'm very disorganized. It's one of the very few advantages of being aged, because okay. So I have been talking, Richard, about your book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s. Before we get into it, and we could spend an hour talking about you. Tell us about you.
Well, what would you like to know about me?
If I say everything, I mean, I've read so much about you. Let's talk about, I want to talk about the bongos, obviously.
Okay.
Talk about a little bit about your background.
Okay, I grew up in Florida, Tampa, Florida, and obsessed with music at a young age, enough so that I got myself into a radio station at age 7 and talked my way into being a DJ. And I had a radio show on Sundays in Tampa called Beach Party, and I got to play a lot of records and learn a lot about music there.
And I'm sure you did a much better job than I.
No.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
We had I had a lot of fun, but also I learned a lot about different types of music and artists and even producers and labels and all that kind of stuff, which all ends up in a book like Music and Revolution, because it's something that's been a lifelong obsession of mine anyway. It's like, how did the music happen? Who made the music? And why did they write these songs? And how did they end up in the studio to record these songs, etc.? It's an endless number of questions that I wanted to answer. And this book gave me a great outlet to do that, But I started out young. I started producing artists by the time I was 15 or 16 in the recording studios. And I got to work with Tiny Tim, who also taught me a lot about Greenwich Village at that time, because that's where he got his start. This was years after his success. So he was able to give me like an overview, not just of Greenwich Village, but about the show business world and the music industry. So that was an education in itself. And that also ends up in this book. By the time I graduated from high school, I had my eye on coming to New York. And even though I took classes in University of South Florida, I couldn't wait to get to New York. And I did so ASAP. And very soon after that, met the guys that became the Bongos within months of being here. So that took me on a trajectory of being on the road for 7 years or so, of doing 300 shows a year, in which so my focus was performance. But I came back for a landing in Greenwich Village, where I had originally intended to be. And since then, I've been wanting to tell the story of Greenwich Village in a book. And this was my first opportunity to put it all together.
Well, I find it absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Because again, it brought back so many memories for me personally. I remember being in New York. I remember frequently hitchhiking to New York. I've often said now, maybe I should try that and see what it's like, almost 50 years later.
Hey.
I said to my wife, I said, I think I'm going to do that. She said, you're insane. She said,
yes.
I'm going to have you committed. You're not going to hitchhike to New York like you did almost 50 years ago. So, but it brought your book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s, just brought back so many memories, Richard. It's so
makes you want to hitchhike to New York. That's pretty good.
It does. It does. So good. Maybe someday I'll just get out there and stick my thumb out. I know
I do think it's a different world now as far as hitchhiking. I think it was a more freewheeling world in the 60s where hitchhiking was the thing. I mean, people got around that way. I don't know. Yes. I'm not sure if it's quite as common these days, but certainly you should give it a try if you feel it.
I can't imagine anyone, and I'm going to point to myself, folks, picking this up hitchhiking unless they have ill intent to serial killer or something. But
exactly, it's a different world. It's just a different world.
Different world. I've got to tell you something that I found. I was going to say odd. It's just like meant to be. Seriously. And if you don't mind, I want to read an email that I got from an author who's become a friend of mine in the UK, in England. She works with grieving people. She wrote the Tsunami of Grief, and I've had her on a number of times, but we communicate a lot off air. So I asked her about something, and here's what she said. It's a date, September 20th. And I met a really interesting man, Eric Anderson. Do you know him? Musician, lyrics writer, etc. We stood in the queue for an hour and a half. When I Googled him later, I saw he's famous. He just said, look out for a YouTube video of this article about dangerous lands. Tell me about him if you know. He took my book card and saying that I'd written a book with talks, such a randomly fun conversation, Wendelin. So then Larry had contacted me about you, put us together, connected us, and your book came. My recall is like the day after she wrote that, or the day I owe something. So the first thing I did, which she was saying, musician, and I was looking through the cost, and I wrote back to her, and it just, forgive me, I'm very excited about this because it would just, I wasn't aware of Eric Anderson.
Oh, yeah.
When she wrote to me, I didn't know. And I said, I'd look. And then when the book came and I took a picture of the table of contents, et cetera, and the index, and sent it to her, it's just amazing how.
Yeah, he's definitely in the book. Eric Anderson is one of the ones of all the songwriters on the scene who was like a romantic poet. So many of them were writing they each wrote different kinds of songs. His were very like romantic poetry sometimes, and even when he was doing a protest song like Thirsty Boots, it's really wrapped in poetry. He was influenced by the beat poets, etc. So yeah, Eric Anderson is like a descendant of the beat poets in a way, and independent cinema, avant-garde cinema. His music has a beautiful artistic style to it. He's still on the road right now. In fact, he's on tour. He's on tour this week.
Yeah, that's right. Again, I saw a lot that brought back a lot of memories. I read a lot. Bands that I hadn't thought of, like the Holy Modal Round.
Of course.
I hadn't thought of probably in a few decades.
We should think about them because
go ahead.
They were the first to use the word psychedelic in a song, and they were cutting edge artists at the time because they were doing folk music, but with a whole different twist on it. They were both traditionalists. They loved those anthologies of folk music, but then they also loved like a spontaneous creativity of the 60s, and they combined the two with a lot of humor and unique singing voices, and they have some great songs. I recommend people listen to the Holy Modal Rounders.
Oh yeah, and I, after reading it in your book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s, Richard Barone, it just got me back into so many things. Like I say, I'm motor mouthing, but there's so many. I'm really excited to have you.
It's all good.
There's so much I want to talk about. The tipping point for you to actually write it. A lot of people get ideas. I should write. Yeah. What was it? It said, I'm doing it. That's it.
Okay. It came in a few stages. One is that in 2016, I made an album called Sorrows and Promises, Greenwich Village in the 1960s. This project came to me, and I wrote about it in the foreword of the book, by a gentleman named Mitchell Cohen, who was is both a journalist and also was the head of A&R for major labels like Columbia and Vanguard, and Columbia, Verve, and Arista Records. He came to me after a show and suggested that my voice would be perfect to take on the songs of Greenwich Village in the 60s and to do an album of that material. Eric Anderson, Fred Neil, Bob Dylan, others. So I did make the album, but I made it a point to research each artist before I did their song, so I kind of had the full history, or as much as I could get, before I sang the songs for the album. That got me on a whole research. I almost would say rabbit hole, but that has a negative connotation. It was a time tunnel of study and I just went deeper and deeper into it. And I wanted to learn everything. I'm going to go back to the beginning of Greenwich Village and why that place had all these songwriters in it at that time. So I wanted to write the book, but I'm on tour. I do perform a lot. I'm also a professor. I teach. I go on the road. I perform. I do events all year long. So it was hard to find the time. But during the pandemic, as COVID hit 2020 or so, I contacted my publisher who had been asking me to write this book. And I said, okay, I'm doing it now. So I started devoting all of my time to writing this book, and nothing else mattered. Nothing else happened. I just wrote the book. I locked myself into this room that you see me in now, which is a kitchen. And, because that's where the snacks are. And the coffee machine and the window, so I could look out on the streets of Greenwich Village. Oh. And I started writing from the beginning, and I wanted to start, I did it in chronological order. And I called people like the Greenwich Village Historical Society to find out that timeline at the beginning of the book that goes back to the 1600s.
Way back, yeah.
That was originally going to be a chapter, but then I realized it was overwhelming to be a chapter, to go back 400 years or 500 years, 600 years. So we made it into a timeline that you can sort of see year by year.
It's great.
It's a quick view of that. And then it brings us up to the 1939 with Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit here in the village at the Cafe Society, which is interestingly right across the street from the Stonewall, where LGBTQ plus riots, truly riots, happened then in 1969. So it's like this corner of like activity. And the village is full of those corners of activity like that. And that's where the story starts, because that's when the folk music revival is really beginning to pick up steam right around that late 30s and into the 40s with Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. And by the time we hit the 50s, it's in full swing, except that they're all blacklisted because they were considered so radical. So this folk revival then takes a second chapter. A second wing or second wave of the folk revival is really what happens in the 60s. Most of this book is really the second wave of this movement of radical music,
When Richard, I got a couple of things.
Yes.
I've got to tell you, I love the map, the Greenwich Village.
Thank you.
From 1961.
I love that map too, yeah.
I'm wondering if that guy still sells copies of it.
It's really hard to locate, but we did, yes, there are copies available of that in the village now. If you're interested in that, I can connect your listeners and you with where to get that map. If you want the large,
down the road. Yeah, I just was enthralled by it.
I love that map too. It's very good. And it shows you what a small community we're talking about. Because if you really look, you have Washington Square Park, that little park, and really just all the streets around it were inhabited by so many folk singers and really folk rock, jazz, but musicians, let's say, around a very small circumference that is just a few blocks in either direction. I mean, you have the Velvet Underground a few blocks to the east, and you have the Love and Spoonful a couple blocks or one block to the west, and you have just this circle of music, and many of them lived in this circle, and they hung out at the clubs, and not just at night, by the way, because clubs like the Cafe would start at noon. You'd go in there at 11 or 12 noon and go to see shows, and it was a 24-hour circus of music. The other thing is that the cafes, like the coffee shop, the Kettle of Fish, and those were just hangouts. So it was just full of musicians hanging out all within these blocks constantly.
Again, and you can read amazingly researched and beautifully written Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s. The author, Richard Barone, is my guest. Go to Richard's website, which is richardbarone.com, richardbarone.com. Lots of information, lots of history too. I've got it before two things before I forget. I've got to say that when you were writing about Tiny Tim, remember Tiny Tim, obviously. Not obviously, I remember Tiny Tim.
Good.
But I more recently, in the last, I don't know, few years, I know I have no grandchildren, so I have no logical reason to watch SpongeBob, except
I like it. Yeah,
it's an escape from reality for me, and a better way than I used to escape reality. Safer way,
I understand.
A better way.
SpongeBob is safe. Yeah.
Well, for me, compared to the other things I would do, because come on, he's a sponge. He lives in a pineapple under the sea.
Hey.
What's more out there than that? But there's in one of the episodes they used Tiny Tim's song, "Living in the Sunlight."
Oh yeah,
and I know. Yeah, and when I was reading about it, I thought about that too. It's just, I'm sorry to go off on that.
No, Tiny Tim is
a great song.
Tiny Tim was at one point, and then I think continues to be in different ways that are hard to now perceive, embedded in our culture, because he was such an out there performer. I mean, he opened the door for so many artists that came soon afterwards, including like Alice Cooper, so many others that were also outrageous. Tiny Tim was really one of the first to be so openly outrageous in his presentation. His long hair, his makeup and his outfits. I mean, he really had created a character that this was something how he was able to perform his music. It was by creating a character. This is something that we've seen now over and over since then, but not really so much before then in pop music.
And very, like you say, very influential. I've got to ask you about the beautiful dedication in your book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s. Will you read it, or I can read it?
Why don't you read it? But yes, I'm very happy with it also, but thank you. Please read it.
It's beautiful, Richard, beautiful. For Josephine Barone, my mother, whose love for music and life drives me every day. See, I'm going to get emotional. And for my students, may their music create a revolution of its own. That's beautiful. Can you tell me a little bit about your mom?
My mom is very into music, all kinds of music. And I grew up in a household where she taught me about different types of music. So I never had the prejudice of, even though I'm more of a rock and roll, I'm a rocker personally, but I always was taught about all kinds of music, including big band or singers like Peggy Lee, etc. I was taught to appreciate all kinds of music. And folk music and every kind. And my mother is that way. She used to sing songs to me of all types. She still does, actually, on the phone. She's in Florida, I'm in New York. But that is a huge inspiration for me always, because she encouraged me to be a musician when I was very young and bought me a guitar, electric guitar, by the way, not acoustic, an electric guitar at age 7. And she really likes rock music and encouraged, when I was in the bongos, she really encouraged us, and all of us would visit my mom often. And when we were on tour, we'd go stay with her. And, it's absolutely what I said in the dedication is absolutely true. And then my students also, because a lot of how I wrote the book and the things I chose to cover in the book, some of them I never would have thought of except for the questions that the students ask me. Especially in the early part of the book, when I talk about Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax and the way they discovered artists down south like Leadbelly and these others, the students had millions of questions about that, because we're in a different world now. Like he talked about hitchhiking, we're in a different world about black and white relationships, etc. But how were things in the 30s and 40s? There was a lot of differences, and the students' questions really helped me shape those early chapters in the book. And the ending of the book came from my students. I mean, I don't want to give away the ending because I want your listeners to read it. But the ending of the book really came from my students, literally. And I wrote about that. I wrote about how it came about in the book. And that's how we got an ending to the story. So, I have to thank them, and I have to thank my mother, because she's still telling me about new bands that she hears and that I need to listen to. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Again, it's very touching.
Thank you.
Dedication. Also, your students are very, very fortunate to have you.
Thank you.
very, very.
I'm fortunate to have my students too. I learn a lot from them, and we do music together sometimes when we can. I mean, when I have events where I can invite them to perform with me, I do. You know.
That's wonderful. And by the way, earlier when you were saying Down the Rabbit Hole has kind
Yeah.
of a negative, not in
Well,
my
people.
studio. Not
Oh,
I've got my rabbit ears.
good. Good. I like rabbit holes.
I
I
know
go into rabbit holes
exactly
all the
what you
time.
mean.
But you know, people say that, you know, I went down the rabbit hole, but you know, really, I don't mind it. I like it, you know.
Yeah. As do I. What's a couple of other Donovan. I know I'm bouncing all over the place. Tell us about Donovan. I mean, I shouldn't say who. Younger people may not have a clue.
I know, and they should. They really should, because Donovan, these are a lot of the artists that I mentioned in the book, Donovan being one of them, but Donovan is a special case because he's also my dear friend and mentor. I've been working with Donovan since 2003. I've been working with Donovan. So this will be going on almost 20 years now. I've known him. He's been a lifelong supporter of what I do, but also a teacher. And I love performing with him. I play guitar with him. But in the 60s, he was pushing, what's the word, the envelope. I mean, he was pushing things because he was started out as an acoustic, as you know, performer, playing acoustic guitar, but he expanded very quickly into psychedelic music and heavy rock. With Hurdy-Gurdy Man has basically Led Zeppelin with him, you know, and he worked a lot with Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin. They were pushing the boundaries of what folk music really was in ways that no one else actually came close to. If you really look at the records he made, starting with Sunshine Superman, using Indian instruments that before the Beatles did, and using, you know, all kinds of sounds and psychedelic effects. He was innovative in every way. Also a great singer and a great lyricist. So Donovan helped define what we think of as 60s music. And I encourage my students to listen to him, and I can encourage everybody to listen to him now, because it's a timeless kind of, because he was so cutting edge at the time, it's timeless. And you know, he's a very special artist. I'm indebted to Donovan in so many ways, including the style of how this book is written. Because early on, I spoke to him on the phone about the writing of this book, and he's made a suggestion to me to write about the people that no one has heard about, that no one, the names that we don't hear all the time, because that's where the story really is. And he was actually extremely accurate with that, because that is where the story is. It's not, those stories are not like prefabricated public relations stories. Those are real stories, you know? It's not like image creating stories. When you talk to someone like Barry Kornfeld, who played guitar for all these artists, he's going to tell you the real deal, because he doesn't have like an image to maintain, you know? So that's who I spoke to a lot. I did talk to some very well-known artists, of course, Buffy Sainte-Marie and so many others in the book, but I really wanted to talk to the behind-the-scenes people, the musicians, the managers, the engineers, those people too. They really helped tell a fuller story. And it's due to Donovan that I did that, because I may not have thought of that.
Yeah,
you know,
that's great.
Quite that way. Yeah,
that's great. And it's obvious how precious that relationship is, that friendship.
Yes,
you write about
very.
You write about the Scottish super. And I love the music. I absolutely love the book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s, richardbarone.com. Richard's the author.
Thank you.
And I am delighted to be talking with you. When the pictures, I've got to mention the pictures, the photography. I don't know where you found, I don't know how you did the research.
I'll tell you how I found those photos. I was, I made several albums for Universal Music in the early 2000s and late 90s. And I wanted to work with David Gahr as my photographer. They asked me, who would you like to do your photos? And I said, well, David Gahr, because I had seen some beautiful photos of Bob Dylan that he took. And they just were exactly the mood that I wanted, right? So we met and became friends. He photographed me for that project, but then he brought me to his home. We did some photos in his home in Brooklyn, and he showed me his archive. And he had fantastic photos of Greenwich Village in the 1960s. This stayed in my mind the whole time. I knew that those photos existed. Now, David has passed since then. And I had to contact his estate, and I got the rights to use one photo for each chapter from his archives, his private archives. And so some of these have never really been used before. A lot of them are backstage and behind the scenes, so it's not the typical publicity photos. You know, it's like Richie Havens backstage at Carnegie Hall, and you know, Pete, an early young Pete Seeger, which I wanted to show the young, because Pete was like,
great.
He was a teenager. You know, when he was working in the early folk music, he was only 18 years old. So I wanted to get the young Pete Seeger somehow represented early on in the book. And I worked with Pete Seeger when he was in his 90s, you know, so I produced his last single and had many conversations. As you know, they appear in the book in little bits and pieces throughout. But, you know, I wanted to show the young Pete, because that energy, he was almost like a punk rocker with his energy. That's, in a way, that's why kind of how what bonded us is that he saw maybe something similar in the music that I was playing that was a little, you know, had that in it. He liked that, and he liked that I was I think that I was a punk rocker, and he invited me to play many shows with him in the last few years of his life.
That's, again, you've got the Pete Seeger picture. I'm sure it's the one that you're referring.
Yeah,
the young one. Just absolutely. I was.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, he's just, you know, it's just archetypal. He's just so pure, so earnest, and you know, the folk music scene had such a purity, and it was like, it wasn't about money, and it wasn't about fame, and it wasn't about celebrity or Instagram or social media. It was just about pure love of music. And then within that pure love of music, can we get a message in there that would help people? That's how it started. Now, of course, by the time the 60s rolled around, because we're getting into the modern world by the 60s, it's already like the space age. Things were evolving, so there's a lot of those artists had the other things going on. The celebrity, they became famous on the cover of magazines, but those early days of the folk revival, as we call it, was about pure love of music, and then the merging of that with a message. It all stems from that, you know, and through the 60s, through the mid 60s, that was the thread that was still there, I think. And even when it changed, the message of the music, the peace, the anti-war message, the civil rights message, that was sustaining the music all as much as the melodies and the lyrics, you know, was the meaning.
And that, again, and how you put it together.
Thank you.
Saying, Richard, I couldn't stop, literally.
Good.
Stop when
Good.
And in fairness, in total honesty, I didn't start by reading it through.
That's
that
okay.
was a little bit later. Initially, I went to the end. You know, the chapter excited me, and all over the place. And then I went back to read, but I was looking.
Well, you know, that's a good point I wanted to mention to your listeners, is that when I wrote this book, I also thought that people may just pick it up and read one chapter. So they're each written as a complete story in a way. The chapters of this book are almost, you could see them as separate essays as well. Because I know this, I mean, I like reading books, but I mean, sometimes I just will pick one up and just at any point and start reading. And I think I try to keep that in mind so that you could pick it up and read a chapter that interests you at that moment. But I do recommend the chronology of reading from the beginning, because that's how it's written. And that really is an unfolding story.
And I think, yes. And again, initially I went wild looking things up, and then reading it. And you're right, the chronology, and it flows. I love
chronology is nice. It's nice to have that. But you know, sometimes even when you see a movie, it's not always in chronological order. They edit it around, so it's kind of written so you could mix up the scenes if you really want to. But in my mind, I think of it as a continuation of that timeline at the beginning. This starts in the 1600s, and then we jump in the 40s and 50s, and then we go through the 60s. To me, I think of the book in that order. But you know, the chapters could be read at your leisure.
Which is great, but I would suggest to people to read it.
I would too.
I would too. Yeah, because of the flow.
Yeah.
A couple of things I've got to mention. Oh, and I've got a drawing of Lou Reed.
Lou Reed.
In the studio, there was an artist that gifted this to me.
Nice.
And I've got to send a picture of it. It's amazing. Lou Reed, talk with us a little bit about Lou Reed.
Well, Lou Reed, just like Donovan, even though they're very different figures in musical history, was also a great mentor and friend to me for many years. And even before I met him, I was a fan of Lou Reed's music anyway. So meeting him was a thrill, and then we stayed in touch until he passed, really. Lou Reed is not always considered part of the Greenwich Village scene with the Velvet Underground because their music was so different, but it really was a very, very much a part of the fabric. They were playing at the Cafe Bazaar, literally half a block from the Love and Spoonful, and their sound was a sort of a foreshadowing of things that were to come in the 80s and 90s and beyond, with grunge and punk and goth. They had all kinds of musical things going on in their music. And I think it's a shame that people don't really understand that they really came up at the same time as Bob Dylan and all the others that we talk about. I mean, they are often sort of segregated into their own category, but they were part of the Greenwich Village scene. They were from the East Village. And, I'm often reminded by someone when I talk to John Sebastian, et cetera, that, there was a West Village scene and an East Village scene, but really they came together in the middle because that's where all the venues were, and many of the venues. And it's a part of the fabric that made it so amazing to me, is that you could also hear Venus and Furs by the Velvet Underground while, and then go down the block and hear Did You Ever Have to Make Up Your Mind by the Love and Spoonful, completely opposite styles of music. Like, they're kind of jug band. The Velvets are kind of like wall of sound grunge or whatever they were doing, which is just fantastic avant-garde music,
That's wonderful. And again, how you connect the people is wonderful. By the way, I've got to tell you, Nancy Griffith, I'm a fan of. Listen to
fantastic. Yeah.
I didn't know she had passed away last year.
Yes, so sad. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't notice. I know I'm jumping all around.
No, it's okay.
The Fugs.
The Fugs,
I have to tell you, I remember getting the Fugs album, and when my mother hearing somebody I didn't realize she was as close as she was.
Yeah.
Freaked out, and she said, "Give that record to me. I'm going to break it. I'm going to break it up." Wow. And this is terrible. I said, "No, no, Mom." I said, "I'll take it on that stump and I'll crash it on the stump or whatever in the backyard. You can watch." Well, I took another one. I don't remember the album, and I stashed the Fugs. I didn't want to get rid of it.
I love the Fugs.
I broke up the other album. I don't know what it was, but whew, I love the Fugs.
I love the Fugs. And you see, we needed what was so rich about this scene is you could have the Fugs and what they were doing, and right next to these other groups that were like gentle folk singers, and then the Fugs are there, and it's all part of one scene. It's unbelievable, really. The diversity in a small bunch of people. There's so much diversity in that, Yeah, the Fugs got described by the CIA. Did you see? There's a quote. I don't have the quote. I mean, I don't know what page everything is on exactly, but there's a quote from the CIA that describes like the something like the Fugs are like the most horrible example of humanity that could possibly exist, or something like that. It's a very severe quote about the Fugs. I love it. It's in there somewhere, but if you look up the Fugs in the index.
And I have to tell you, I've had a guest on, H.K. Roy, who was a former CIA agent in different places, and he wrote a book. Obviously, that's not his real name, his given name.
Yes, of course.
I was really, I didn't know whether I should send him the CIA song.
Oh, yeah, the CIA song. Right.
Who can?
Yeah, it's a very funny song.
Yeah. Oh,
it's based on
hilarious.
It's based on Secret Agent Man by Johnny Rivers. It's just a rewrite in a way of Secret Agent Man. Like they made it into CIA Man.
I wasn't sure if he would. I felt that he'd been on a few times and we've emailed back and forth, and I felt he would take it in a lighthearted way. But I was kind of couldn't hold my breath. I sent it to him. And he wrote back to me. He said, "This is hilarious. I love it."
It is really funny. And I mean, but still, you never know if someone's going to be offended by something. They were deliberately trying to be, somewhat. I don't want to say offensive, but yes, offensive in some ways. They were pre-punk. Also, they were like the Fugs were also. You could consider them pre-punk because they were so outspoken and had that. That edge. element of outrageousness. I first met Ed Saunders. I met him at CBGB's.
Good.
He was there seeing the Ramones or something. Yeah.
Because again,
it was at a show. It was at a punk show. I mean, and I was introduced to Ed Saunders of the Fugs at CBGB, so that makes sense because that's a continuation. People don't always see that either. That the timeline of this book that ends around 68, 69. That's not where the story ends, because really, the next wave of by the 70s. Then there's a revitalization of the New York music scene with the punk rockers, and there's a thread. Like Patti Smith, who then was sort of a punk priestess, she was opening for Phil Ochs at Max's Kansas City, and I mean, so that's a really interesting kind of 60s and 70s coming together there, and then the punk movement when she was part of that, the Ramones. It's really just a little more East Village, but it can be seen as a continuing thread of downtown New York music, how it evolved.
Yeah. Richard Barone, that's right. One of the things when you wrote about Patti Smith, that's another one. Piss Factory.
Oh, I love it.
Let me do the disclaimer. The Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland, is an adult-oriented show intended for and only for a mature adult audience.
Of course.
Discretion is strongly advised. But what I hadn't thought or listened to Piss Factory in I can't tell you how many years. So again, your book it's so precious to me because
Thank you.
Again, for the memories and just to remember some of the artists.
Thank you.
Holy Motor Ride. Thank you. You wrote it. Thank you. Ed Sanders, when I remember buying the album Sanders Truck Stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just, I still play songs from that every once in a while. It cracks me up. And the punk, talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, your music, bongos and punk, because you said, you're a punk rocker.
Yes, but the bongos were more pop punk, really. We there's not much anger in the bongos music. The bongos were like a really fun band, but we were definitely inspired by punk because we loved the Ramones, and we did many shows with the Ramones early on when we first started out. And we played our first shows even though we did start in Hoboken, New Jersey, at our club Maxwell's that we helped to get started. We played at Max's Kansas City, which was then, sort of a punk venue. And we came out of that world. The bongos, though, we love dance music. And so there was always that element, too. But we were surrounded by punk acts. And when we toured, we would tour with punk bands. So we were in that world, but more in a pop sense, Yeah. Because we got on the radio. I mean, the bongos were played on the radio, and were played in clubs as dance music in clubs. So we had our own sound.
I misspoke. You were into punk music, correct?
But, yeah. But I really early.
Yeah, when I listened.
Yeah, the early punk music was a big influence on me. It made me want to come to New York when I heard Patti Smith, her Horses album. And Richard Hell and the Voidoids were a favorite of mine, and of course the Ramones, and like I said, and others. I mean, and I liked the Sex Pistols. I liked all of it. I wanted to be part of that. It's just that by the time we got together and with our combined musical tastes in the group, then it created its own sound that really wasn't one genre or another. It was our own.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, we just did our own thing,
You did. I've got them somewhere here here in my notes, my highly organized.
Yeah, I can tell.
You did 2020 saw some reunion concerts with the bongos before COVID hit.
Yeah.
And also what was that like? Let's talk. Yeah,
we just did a whole run in August of this year. We did the bongos do shows once in a while. We played Lincoln Center in August, and we did several shows in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then that's it for now, because we don't really all live in the same state anymore, and we're not able to hang out. We don't live together anymore like we did. It's just a different time. Yeah. When we started the group, we all lived in the same apartment in Hoboken, and it was so easy. We just would play shows. Now it's about traveling and getting the right type of venue that we like. We really like outdoor shows, and we like, it's hard. You have to line that stuff up, and we all do different things. We all get busy with our own separate lives. So it's different now, but we love it when we can do it. Once a year or so, we do some shows, special shows.
That's very, very cool. Richard Barone, I've got to ask you, what is it like being, how do I want to say it? What is it like hearing your music on the radio?
Well, it's a thrill to hear. It's like with the very first time, especially, it was a thrill. There was a DJ, Vince Scelsa, in New York. He was very influential at the time. He's been off the air now because he just left. He left radio, but he was on a radio station here called WNEW, which was the big rock station in New York. And he was the first to play the bongos on commercial radio. And it was an absolute thrill. It sounded, for one thing, radio changes the sound of a recording. It was an education to hear it the first time on the radio because it sounded different. It's like, wow, we learned so much by hearing him play our records on the radio because we learned what we wanted, how we wanted to mix it to sound great on the radio. It was an absolute thrill. I can't really describe it. We were just elated. I was barely 20 at the time that he first started playing us on the radio. And that started the ball rolling for us. Radio was a big way to get, now we have it's a different world. And,
sure is.
The thing about it now with music is that not everybody's listening to the same station. Everybody has their own private feed of music. So to be on a station that a lot of people were listening to at the same moment,
yeah, it was
opened a lot of doors for us because suddenly we have how many people live in Manhattan and how many people had WNEW on this? It's potentially in the millions in this area. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because go ahead.
And if it's a popular radio station and they're playing your record, you're going to hit a lot of people at the same exact moment. It's not like a scattered like it is now on YouTube or Spotify that people you get these little splotches of listening. It was then everyone hearing it at the same time. This is how stars were made. Now, I'm not saying that happened to me because I don't think that I'm talking about the explosion of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan or the Doors on a television show, that you'd get an explosion of viewers all at one time. And that caused a chain reaction then of word of mouth, etc. Sure. But now it's just so scattered because there's millions of channels. There's thousands of possible ways to hear music. And
you can record it. You can record a TV show or whatever and play it later.
Yeah, it's not at the same time. It's the synchronicity that's missing. Synchronicity in music is lost. It used to be just hear it at the same time. Everybody heard I Want to Hold Your Hand at the same time. It was like a group. It was like a group orgasm or something. Like everybody hearing music at the same moment. And then now it's like little splurts of Oops.
Yeah, and it's all. You okay? I get. Yeah, it's the same ring that I use, an old phone, because
it's only the ring. That's the ring on if it comes through my computer. Otherwise, I use a different ring. But that's because it's coming through here. Yeah, technology. I don't even know what that. I declined the call for the moment. I'll catch it later.
Richard Barone, about that ring, the old phone ring.
Yeah.
Me, in the early days of the smartphones, when you could put your own ringtone on. I use that because I hear all these other sounds. It's like, how am I going to know it's the phone?
Right.
But I know that ring. What's interesting.
That's a classic iPhone ring. That is a classic iPhone ring. Yeah.
When I hear, I might be watching an old movie on Turner Classic Movies or whatever, and the phone rings on the show, and I'm looking for my phone. That's the downside. Every time you hear that sound.
That's funny. I know what you mean. Yeah, that's funny.
Ian and Sylvia, I'm a huge fan of the Four Strong Winds, and
it's beautiful. Yeah.
Their involvement in the Village. Again, I don't expect you to remember each and every because there's so many in here.
I'm happy to talk about it. I love them, and they came into the Village from Canada, and he was really cool. He was like a rough. I think it was like a rodeo rider. They had a really nice synergy between their, his kind of rough edge and her sweetness. And he wrote, what's cool about them too, is that he wrote, you said Four Strong Winds. His first song, I think, that he ever wrote was inspired by Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan, who he claims he had just heard that at the Kettle of Fish, where people would show songs to each other. And Dylan showed him Blowin' in the Wind, and he wrote Four Strong Winds. Wow. He wrote that in Bob Dylan's manager's apartments. So they were very connected. Everybody's so connected, and And then Sylvia wrote that great song, You Were on My Mind. and she wrote that in her bathtub at the Washington Square Hotel. It was then called the Hotel Earl, but now it's currently called the Washington Square Hotel. But they each wrote their first initial songs for both of Ian and Sylvia Tyson were their most famous songs. It's interesting how, you right out of the box, your first song becomes covered by other people and becomes like a signature piece.
That's, again, the name of the book. You'll love it, folks. Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s. This one is not leaving my collection. I've had to whittle down books because at my age, I don't want someone to have to go through the books and think, was this one important to them? Was this one? So I've been donating tons of books. This one's staying with me till.
Good, thank you. That means a lot. It really means a lot to me that you say that. Yeah.
And I'm sincere. I
believe you.
Right with that, and sincere. It's been so wonderful for me. I've got to mention Cafe Reggio.
Yeah,
that brought back a lot of memories. Used to go there a lot in the village, and I've just got to say, and I'm going to email you or I'll tell you a story about the Reggio.
Okay.
Off-air. It's not a bad story.
Okay.
It's a wonderful story, but it's just it's yeah.
Well, that was the first place in America to have cappuccino. The first cappuccino was served at the Cafe Reggio. Yeah, it's still there. Yeah, I go there once in a while. Yeah, it's still there. I go there, and sometimes I have, like, if I'm doing an interview for the book or something, we do it there just to keep the the vibe,
the atmosphere. Oh,
right.
God,
Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. That's great. I'm glad to know they're still there.
They're still there. Yeah.
One of the other, I've got to mention, you talk about the Roaches.
Oh yeah, I love them.
I bought the first album. I remember buying the first album, and I've been fortunate enough to have Suzy Roach on.
She's fantastic.
Times. Yeah.
I love her.
Still working with her daughter. That's great.
Yeah, Lucy. Yeah, Lucy.
Yeah.
Lucy's her daughter, and I've worked with all of them. I love them. They're some of my closest musical friends in the music industry. And Terry and I especially have a partnership. We've written songs together, and she just performed with me. We did a book launch this Thursday, a few days ago, at the Museum of the City of New York. Wow. And Terry played with me. We had Carolyn Hester, who I write about in the book, and David Amram. Now he's 91, and he performed with us. And Suzanne Vega, and also Carolyn Hester's daughter, and myself. And we had different other musicians. Steve Adabo, who produced Suzanne Vega and me on my album, he played guitar with us, and we had some historians adding their comments. That was a beautiful event on Thursday.
Yeah, it had to be, and the music had to be.
It was fantastic.
I hope these questions aren't too weird. Autographing the book that you wrote. That's got to feel.
Well, yes,
people want it.
Yeah,
personalized.
I love signing the books. Because I think of it as, when we made this, making this book, not just me, like the designer of the book. We wanted to make an artistic object too. It's not just the writing; it's the idea of making the book, the photography, and all of that. When I sign it, I'm thinking of it as signing like a drawing or a sketch or a painting. And I think of it as that's part of it for the artist to sign it. I wish that David Gahr was here, who did the photographs, if he was alive, to sign it with me. And and the designer Roger Gorman. We all put together something that's something that we're proud of. So thank you. Yeah, I love signing the books. It's fun to sign them for people. Yeah.
Richard Barone, I've got to say, you've got such a good heart and so giving and generous, because you want to spread the accolades to others that were involved in the book. That's not. I've interviewed tons of authors over the year, and that's not always the case. But it's so accurate. It took a team to put it together. And
it takes a village.
It takes a village.
It takes a village. Yeah. Doing a project like this, I depended on these friends to really help me pull it together. And I thank them in the book, in the acknowledgements,
Oh, it's beautiful. You are, that's what I mean. You're just very, very generous and giving with that.
Thank you.
I've got to ask you about, by the way, this was in no way how I anticipated the interview going. Not on your on mine. I'm just bouncing around.
That's okay.
Sometimes I write questions down. Rarely do I follow them. But
That's okay.
Lenny Bruce, I was a huge fan of Lenny Bruce in the very early days. And I remember buying his early albums and just loved him. Still think about it today, still play some of it.
Yeah.
I've got a car with a CD player, and I've got a Lenny Bruce CD in the car now. Yeah. Lenny Bruce in the Village.
Yeah, I first learned about Lenny Bruce from Tiny Tim. I was like, again, a teenager when I met Tiny, so I didn't know who Lenny Bruce really was. I knew the name maybe vaguely from hearing it, maybe mentioned somewhere, but I didn't know of Lenny Bruce until Tiny Tim told me the stories and explained to me how he suffered from being arrested for obscenity because of his the words he would use in his comedy and his really social satire. And that left a big impression on me as a teenager. So when I wrote the book, I knew that that's another thing that was going on in the Village is the social commentary of Lenny Bruce, how that really had a big influence on the songwriters too, on Dylan and others, because Lenny's laying it on the line and with words, and they were trying to, they'd pick up on this and put it into the music, you know what I mean? So Lenny Bruce would play at the same venues as the musicians we're talking about in the book. The Cafe A Go-Go, I think Lenny Bruce was arrested there at least once. And I think he might have played the Vanguard. These places, it's important to remember, were not just music. The spoken word element, poetry, and social commentary were also a part of the music scene. We don't really have that now. When we go see a concert, we don't. I just saw Metallica like a couple weeks ago. I mean, you don't really you don't expect to see like a Lenny Bruce come on and do it. But at one point, and this faded in the 70s, but like George Carlin is someone who kind of carried on a bit of that tradition in the 70s through the 80s, where he would be on a bill maybe with a rock band, maybe, I'm not sure, I think so, certainly on television he was, but it's part of the music and it inspired the lyrics. Lenny Bruce was a big influence on a lot of these, I think.
Huge, yeah. And again, I've heard many of the routines so many times.
Yeah,
I could do them, not in his voice, but I know all the lines and just absolutely still love him. Somebody just emailed me that said that there is a very popular television show called Mrs. Maisel.
Yeah,
and
they filmed. They were just filming on this street where I live. Yeah, it's set in the 60s, really? Greenwich Village. Yeah, but from what I've never watched. I've watched just the first few episodes. I haven't connected with it yet, so I can't really comment on it.
No. They're telling me that Lenny Bruce. Well, obviously,
I'm sure they messaged. Yeah, I'm sure they messaged
in that TV series.
I'm certain of that. Yeah, I'm certain. It's a period piece. I've just seen the visuals and I saw the first couple of episodes. I know they use the Gaslight, which is a venue that we talk about a lot in the book. I'm not sure if it's actually painted in the right tone that the Gaslight actually was, but I'm curious to see that show at some point.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, I know a lot of younger people. Even some older people, just not as old as me, aren't aware of Lenny Bruce, and his comedy is and it's tragic.
Well, how many people in this book we can say that about that people aren't really aware of? Carolyn Hester was fantastic. She was a star at the time. She was a big star. She was on the cover of magazines, but we don't know. Paul Clayton, one of my favorites in the book, a great young folk hero, was completely forgotten by many. And Lenny Bruce is a name that we don't hear very often. Tiny Tim, we don't hear much. Just mentioned.
That's right.
You just mentioned you don't hear much about Donovan. Correct. I'm like, so I'm trying to let's remember some of these people that laid the groundwork for the future, which is now. They laid the groundwork for our popular culture now. Without these people, we would be a very different culture, musically different and attitudes. Lenny Bruce, these were people that made huge changes in society.
Sure did.
And Donovan and these others, they made huge changes in music. Like to have a wild electric guitar solo in a folk song was not common. I mean, they broke the boundary, they broke the mold, whatever. And they changed things so that now we can do all that stuff.
Yeah,
basically,
exactly. Yeah, and
right?
again, when you were saying, yeah, and about, yes, and Richard, and about Lenny getting arrested and that whole history, and
Yeah.
I love how he explains it, but it had to be horrible for him at the time to.
Oh, it was devastating. I think it killed him.
Yeah,
You know, a
and
lot of people did not survive the 60s. And I don't mean just like OD. I mean, a lot of people couldn't survive mentally the 60s. And Lenny Bruce, I mean, he couldn't, it was just too much. I mean, he was arrested so many times and he couldn't seem to do anything. You know, he was, I think, the survivors, like Pete Seeger, who survived the blacklist of 17 years, it's a miracle that he was able to come out intact as such a whole person, you know, and such a vital performer until he passed. But for 17 years, he couldn't be on any national media. That's a long time.
that's a long time. And again, a lot of young people, well, as I say, even people not as old as me, as I am, but don't remember any of that and wouldn't
I
understand
know.
that the speech and what you're saying and what you're talking about was
Yeah. They had this, there
the
was some
attempt
suffering.
to censor that was, go ahead.
Yeah. There was a lot of suffering, I think, with these artists. I mean, that's why, I mean, so a few of them were able to slip by the blacklisting and the arrest. I mean, Harry Belafonte somehow, because of his immense charismatic personality, was able to, even though he was blacklisted, they couldn't deny him his television time. Like he had to be in the media and in movies and in films. They couldn't deny him. But many artists were completely squashed. Their careers were ended because they were considered radical, you know? So there was a lot of suffering. That's why Sorrows and Promises was the title of the album that I made, because there was the promise of the 60s, but there was also so much sorrow, you know? And others, you know, as you know, the politicians, how many were assassinated? There were a slew of assassinations in the 60s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a lot of people stopped in their tracks. Let me put it that way. And musicians also, a lot of them were stopped in their tracks. And Lenny Bruce and others, they were not allowed to express themselves. It's sad, but true.
Personal cost. It's great personal cost.
That's right. That's right.
To society.
It absolutely, and that's what I'm trying to appreciate those people for what they did. They were, you know, they broke, like I said, they actually broke through so others could come through. They were like, in a way, they were sacrificial because they because of what they went through, we didn't have to, other people could get through somehow.
Paved the way. Yeah. Paved the way.
They paved the way.
That's a really good point. And again, a lot of people don't realize that. Phil Maurice, you're cool time wise. I'm going.
Yes. Yeah. Let me just. Why don't you go ahead? I'm gonna adjust a phone call that I have coming up. I mean, you go ahead. You ask me a question. I'm listening.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking with the amazing Richard Barone. His new book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 60s. And I'm getting blown away by this book and absolutely love it. When you're back, Richard, let's talk a little bit about the Fillmore East. He talks about the Fillmore, all these artists. Well, Fillmore East. And again, there are people that, myself included, that have records, you know, live at the Fillmore.
Yeah.
Live at the Fillmore East.
Oh, these venues, it was so many, you know, people ask me, I get a lot of, I'm right now doing, as you know, a lot of interviews for the book. And people ask me about the other music scenes that were happening in the country at that time, the Cambridge and Boston, you know, Boston, Cambridge, San Francisco. You know, there's something about what was happening in the Village, though, in New York, in which the venues were in a lot of them, number one, in a very concentrated area. So the Fillmore East, you know, it was a larger venue. There's so many different sizes of venues and so many different types of venues. Fillmore is more of a concert venue, and I never got to go there. I guess it evolved finally into the Palladium in New York, if I'm not mistaken. Did the Fillmore East become the Palladium in New York? The same structure, the same building? I think it became the Palladium.
Yeah.
Next.
But
that was a big venue. You know, at first the venues, that's the thing interesting also about the book. And I tried to lay this out, if you read it in order in the timeline. The venues at first were so tiny, they could barely hold like 50-ish people, maximum 100 maybe if they break the fire code. But then, you know, it grew. By the time the Cafe A Go Go and these others, then they got bigger and bigger. And, you know, they just to contain the number of people that wanted to go to these shows. And the Fillmore was getting to the place now where we, in the later 60s, where, you know, the audiences were huge. They were, but the Gaslight didn't even have Dave Van Ronk in his book talks about how the Gaslight, which was popular, didn't even have, the floor was still like a coal cellar. It was still not even paved. When the Gaslight first opened, he performed there. It didn't even have a floor, basically. It was just like coal or sand, you know? Yeah, the venues were where they put music wherever they could. Their basement. It was a basement. So, you know, and when I talked to Donovan about when he saw Richie Havens for the first time. And he says, well, it was just sort of an alleyway. It was like, I said, but Donovan, what was it called? He says, I don't know. I dug around. I found out that it had a name, and it's in the book. You know, but they're like every little crevice in the village was that they could do it in and put music in, but they were tiny. That's why it's such a thrill when Woodstock happened in 1969, because some of these artists that had been playing the small clubs are now playing to 500,000 people overnight. They somehow
went from small,
The village venues are basically small, but for the most part. I mean, you can go to them now. Cafe Wa is still open. It's a basement.
They're almost open.
Yeah, Cafe Wa is open. Yeah, and you know the thing about it is that these were basement. That the first venue that was not a basement was called Folk City, Gertie's Folk City. That was on the first floor. Most of the venues you had to crawl downstairs into a dark alley, dark hallway down to the basement. Yeah,
but wonderful, and again, wonderful music.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. And that's, I love that about what you write about in this wonderful book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s.
Yeah. I put 19 in there, but yeah.
No, I keep going by that and calling it the 60s, the 1960s.
Yeah, because in the 2060s, people will say, oh, do they mean the 2060s? I want the book to be around that long, you know?
Well, yeah. And you will be. I won't. I'll be. I'm kind of asking a question I asked you a little bit before, but if you can tell me, Richard Barone, documenting this, you as a young man documenting all this stuff that's obviously before your time,
Yeah.
And gifting it to the world. I mean, writing this is history. I mean, it's a very entertaining book, but it's historical. What does that feel like, knowing that you're, again, the history, here you got an old guy in my 70th year. So a little older was the early parts of that. Yet there's so many things I learned about, and firstly, I love music, obviously, yet an area that I didn't know. Again, I didn't think about all the history but just how you put it together. You have documented that into this book. What's that like?
I felt it was in a strange way. I felt it was kind of like my duty because of my obsession. I felt that it was my duty to put this together. I know that sounds a bit metaphysical or something, but I really felt
it is what it is. If that's how you feel.
I really felt it was like a calling that, okay, I've grown up knowing about Greenwich Village and knowing about the music. And I felt like now having the opportunity of the pandemic when I could not perform or do anything else, I thought, well, this is my time to do it. And I did feel it was a calling. That's why I talked about in the intro, I talked about this ghosts and the spirits. I really feel that they were saying, tell our story. Yeah. And I felt Dave Van Ronk, especially, very strongly. He lived on my block. You know, I feel those spirits were around me and they were telling me, tell our story. Someone's got to tell our story. You know, I mean, I just felt a calling to do it. It was for no other reason except that I don't think that this story has ever been told quite right, number one, and two, from the point of view of a musician. Because a historian can write a book, but it's not going to be from the music. It's going to be coming from another agenda. I'm writing about, like, how does it feel for a musician to experience this music? And that when I play the music, like, what does it make me feel? It comes through, their spirits come through when I play the music. That's why I wrote the book with my guitar next to me the whole time, because I would pick it up and play the song and understand, like, wow, their fingers did this too. And they were writing a minor chord because they wanted this moment to be sad or something. You know what I mean? It's like, I tried to understand why they wrote and how they wrote the songs. And that, without really always saying that in the book, that's what gave me each inspiration to write the next section.
That's
you
so
know,
cool. I appreciate you sharing that. And again, Richard Barone, I've got to say, you are such a amazing human. When I think about all those things and how you put it together, and what all this about you and doing the research, but how you put it together. And when you said that about the spirits of some urging
yeah,
it, I'm all in with that.
I really believe that. Yeah,
no doubt. Why, when you say it, I'm not one that's going to roll my eyes. I absolutely believe that.
I'm not making it up. I felt it,
No,
and I would
believe
walk at night. I went out walking down the streets where they lived, and I would go to their houses. I mean, I live right in the middle of it all, so I would take these late walks, like 2 a.m. or something. Just there was no one on the streets, and I would walk around. I really felt. I tried to understand what it would have. I could feel what it might have been like then, you know, and I wanted it to come through in the book in that way.
Are you on Waverly, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Yeah,
because I'm not exposing anything. It's in,
that's all right.
obviously I knew that somehow because
Yeah.
And I love the picture of you of you at photographs that you have in the book. Again, it's just amazing. It's richardbarone.com. Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s. That's 1960, folks. In 19, you know, a lot of people wouldn't even think that. It's already coming out of my mouth that Donovan was still around. Very honestly, I was not aware of it. I'm one of those people.
Donovan was quite young. You know, Donovan was only 19, so Donovan is about 5 years younger than Dylan and the others. He's at least 5 years younger than the Beatles and Dylan. He was a teenager and had when he had his first hit, "Catch the Wind." I believe he was 18, so he's a little younger. He's 75.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I knew he was older than me, and I'm thinking, I didn't know.
He's amazing. He's a force of nature. He's a force of nature.
And that relationship has got to be wondrous for you. I know we talked about that before.
It's a treasure to me. It's a treasure. He wrote a poem Donovan wrote a poem for one of the chapters. Begins with a poem that Donovan wrote especially for this book about Richie Havens. Yeah.
Richie Havens.
Yeah, it's a chapter. Do you know Richie Havens? Are you familiar with Richie Havens?
He was at Woodstock, of course.
Yes, of course.
I'm an old guy, Richard.
So
of course I am.
Chapter 10, which I call the exploding, the plastic, and the inevitable, also begins with a poem by Donovan that he wrote for this book that I just love, and it just describes him seeing and hearing Richie Havens for the first time in one of the cellar venues.
That's what, again, seeing that and knowing that he's alive, and how you speak about him in the book, it's like, wow. I'm glad. I just didn't. I'm sure there's a lot of people that didn't think that also. I'm certainly not the only one. If you're my age, you certainly go ahead.
You know, Donovan's not able to tour in the United States as much as he would like to, but for various reasons. But he performs in Europe and in England and Ireland. He lives in Ireland, so you know he gets around over there, but he doesn't get to tour the States as much as he would like to.
Well, I certainly hope he is able to soon.
Yeah.
Do you have any desire to read that poem since it's not long? Are you okay with that? If you don't,
Chapter
Richard,
10. No, I don't mind.
I
cannot read it. I wish he would read. I wish he could read it for us because with his accent, it's even better. You know.
Great. I've got to tell you, here's how I feel. When we're done with the interview, you're going to get in touch with our mutual friend Larry. Can I say who?
Yes.
You okay if I say?
Absolutely.
Larry
Absolutely.
Kerwin, Larry Kerwin, who I love, a Black 47, and you can reply saying, "Why did you connect me with that whack job?" You know?
No. Let me read you the poem. It's called "First Night in the Village." Yes. So this was It's referring to Donovan's first night visiting here from the UK.
Wow.
Havens in the basement, hands like a collier, no teeth to speak of. I had to descend below the streets to hear where the song sang. There sat great Richie, thumb like a capo, belting it out, his raw vox of gravel. We palled it up then. He knew that I knew. We were the first wave, cresting the splendor of all that soon will be, a haven for youth. Donovan 2021.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And again, as you say, it's at the beginning of chapter 10 in your wonderful book, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s. Richard Barone, the author, richardbarone.com, richardbarone.com. We've got links up. Just go you just go right to richardbarone.com.
Thank you.
Are you another 15 minutes? I hate to ask you. Or no?
I think 10. I can do 10.
10. Okay. Okay. Thank you. You're very generous. You're very generous.
I'm juggling a schedule, but 10 is good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Cool. Again, I could go on and on about so many things. John Sebastian.
John Sebastian. What a character! A great character, and funny, very funny, but also a virtuoso. A virtuoso harmonica player, and his father was also not only a virtuoso harmonica player, but the only virtuoso harmonica player who was signed to RCA Records as a solo artist. His father, John B. Sebastian, actually had albums of his own, which is kind of interesting that a harmonica player would get signed to a major label, doing harmonica albums. I guess there was another, Toots Tillman was another in that era who was also harmonica virtuoso, I think, who played on a lot of great records. But John Sebastian grew up in Greenwich Village, right on Washington Square Park, and he saw the whole evolution of what we're talking about. But he grew up there as a child. He saw the artist, the development we're talking about, and he was a part of it. And by the time he was old enough to have his own band, the Love and Spoonful, he had already been in a group called the Even Dozen Jug Band and other groups. But I think he was one of the defining characters of the Greenwich Village sound by mid-60s. 65 is his favorite year, he said. And that was the year that Love and Spoonful really came on the scene and had a string of hits that were almost like the Beatles. They were like the Village Mop Tops, they called them, because they had almost as many hits as the Beatles were having.
And it brought back a memory for me seeing him when I was young. I don't know, 15, whatever, at a place local people know, at Stanville Auditorium, and it was just wonderful when they played there.
Oh yeah, they're great.
And so
he was at Woodstock. He wasn't intending to play at Woodstock. I don't know if you know the story. He was in the audience, and because how Woodstock became, it was in 1969. I mean, Woodstock 69. Because it was so difficult to get there because of the traffic. Explosion of traffic that happened. Some artists were late in arriving. Of course, they used helicopters, whatever. Yeah. But they needed somebody to fill in some time. So John Sebastian happened to be backstage visiting, and they asked him if he would perform. And he did a career reigniting performance there when he performed at Woodstock, entirely in tie-dye of his own design.
That's very cool, by the way.
Yeah.
That's very cool. You write that also. They can get the book through your website. Availability.
Yes.
Tell us about availability.
The book is available at my website, and it's also available at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, and really any book. It's pretty much well distributed through all the different book distributors. But if you want a signed copy, they can go to my website, because I have a which says shop. I think it's I think that's where we can do those I can sign for people if they would like that. But you can get it at Amazon easily, and all those sites. It's at all book retailers are selling it.
I used it many years ago. I still say it. It's available everywhere online. Please try to buy it as close to home as possible. And
yes, I agree with that.
I know
the local bookshops are great.
Yeah, a lot of independents are gone.
I know.
IndieBound, you can buy through IndieBound. But you can
IndieBound has it. Yeah.
At the Barnes and Noble, I came to realize, I know it's a huge chain, but they're hiring people in your community. They're renting
That's right.
space or buying space in your community.
That's right.
So, that's your neighbor's kid or your neighbor works there. If you've got a car dealership, they're making money there. They come buy your car. So it's go to Barnes and Noble and get it if you can.
Yeah.
Amazon, some miraculous way, can have it delivered like what, tomorrow, the next day.
Yeah, they're super fast.
Yeah.
Amazon is super fast, and that's the fastest way to get it. But I mean, I also
Your
like all the
website.
other ones. I like IndieBound. I think those are all great. I just love people to have the book wherever they get it. All these different places.
I have to tell you, Rich, I had authors that give me a little pushback on
Really?
that. I say, yeah, I want them to buy it at Amazon or get it at Amazon. They want their ratings.
Well, because they want the rating, but
I get that.
That's fine.
I
use everything myself. I use Amazon a lot, but the thing is, I think people have to have their own favorite choice. Because some people, whatever works for you, I'm happy with that.
That's right, and you love the book. Another weird question before you have to split, because I'm already thinking, how would you make the decision if you could go back to one of the clubs I'm sure you get asked this all the time, in the 1960s? I don't want, or a couple of clubs, not to have to pick just one.
Yeah.
Explore that with me. If you could go back, somehow we could make it happen.
I think I would have loved to be the Gaslight. I think that one, I've heard recordings of Dylan there and others, and it's so intimate. I mean, that was the thing about this music. It was people were speaking to one another in this music in a very intimate, like in your face kind of way, because the clubs were so small. That affected how the songs were written. Who says that? I've never even said that. But I mean, I think that part of the reason the lyrics are the way they are, they're so personal sometimes. I think it's because the audience was right in your face. They were in a very small space together. You see what I mean? It wasn't like a big stage.
Yeah. Right, yeah. It wasn't a big separation between.
No separation. The audience is right sitting there. You're looking at them. When Dylan is starting out, he's singing to an audience that is right there. So I think I would have loved to have been at the Gaslight when these artists were making their debuts. Janis Ian is an artist you haven't mentioned, but when she was 14 years old playing at the Village Gate, and I would have loved to have been to those shows and to see these artists communicating in the small clubs. Maybe the Cafe Wha of that era during the lunchtime shows I would have liked to have gone to, when Fred Neil was the MC, and a woman like Karen Dalton, a name that now we don't know, but she was influential at the time, like singing with Dylan playing harmonica for her. I would have loved to have been in that scene just to see the intimacy of that too, because they were writing a future history of pop music without realizing it.
I know it.
Or maybe they did realize it, but I don't think so. But a part of this because the small venues let them do that. So that's what I would have liked to have gone to that.
Yeah,
those places.
I appreciate you exploring that, because I think again, to get to the small venues, and I love how you characterize them. It's intimate, and they were.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Intimate, so much different. You were there with the artists, not big separation with security, et cetera, et cetera. They're up on a stage somewhere.
So, it was a different kind of entertainment. It was entertainment, but it was also communication. Yeah. So it was like when we go to see these artists like Eric Anderson, any of these, I think audience members, like myself, if I were one of them, I would go there to see, maybe if it was me, I'd go to see what they had to say. Not just to be entertained, but like, what's he going to talk about this time? Or, if you go see Dylan, like, what's he going to rant about? Or what's he going to talk about? It's a different kind of expectation. When we go see music now, I tend to go to be entertained. But I think in this era that we're talking about, it was like, what are they going to talk about? What are they going to sing about is what I mean. What are the lyrics going to talk about? And that would have been fun to be part of that, to go and never know what to expect, number one. And number two, to communicate with the musician, like having, just like we're talking now, the thought processes of a musician come through music. How interesting that would have been.
That you are such a thoughtful, seriously, such a thoughtful young man, such a thoughtful person, and so giving. I just, I really appreciate that about you. Your personality is wonderful, but you're so thoughtful about things and so heart-centered. That's how it feels to me. Very, very heart-centered. Would you?
Thank you.
That you are? agree? I don't know. Maybe you don't want to.
It's well, I will say that I write from my heart. I would say that, and a lot of the book comes from feelings as much as history or facts. I think that's if my book is different than other like books of music history, I think it's because it's really written from an emotional point of view. Like I really want to know what happened to these people, and I say that in the book. Like what happened to him? I needed to find out. I would call someone, and maybe it was after midnight, and I'd have to make frantic phone calls. I go, what happened to him? What happened? Where is he? Or where is she? And it's because I got emotionally invested in all of them. So this book is really it's really written from the heart. I mean, as much as it's an intellectual process to write a book, this was also an emotional process to process a book,
And you come through with that. The book comes through with that. Again, Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s. You've got a great website, richardbarone.com, richardbarone.com.
Thank you.
We've got the links up everywhere. I know you've got a split. I have absolutely loved this, and I'm so grateful that we were able to figure out a time.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with you, Louis. I love it, and I'm just very, very grateful. Thank you.
I'm grateful to and for you, and I love it. Have I said that before on the show? Thank you, Richard, so much.
You're welcome.
I know you got to split. It's richardbarone.com, richardbarone.com. Get the